guys? We're at the Bear River Massacre site. Obviously it's backwards for you, but this is the monument that is erected here. I do want to point out that I am out here, rain or shine, for you guys. Alright, so this particular location is gorgeous. I'm just going to kind of pan it because this whole valley area is just beautiful. Bear River, who'd have known? I've never actually been here before. But this marks the general location of where the massacre, well, the battle beginning and the massacre following occurred. And you kind of get an idea of the landscape here. They're down in a ravine. Part of the reason for that is we're talking about the Shoshone Indians from the northwestern region. This particular location was a home for them because in a ravine like this, they're relatively protected from some of the ill effects of severe winter storms. So this is where they would hang out, and I'm sure that they took full advantage of the wildlife that is sure to be around in this area, whether that's hunting game or hunting fish or whatever. But one thing to point out here as far as the battle is concerned, see that ridge up there? This is the ridge that they would have come up from the south. So this is like toward Utah. We're in Idaho right now, and toward Utah this way. So Colonel Connors and his California volunteersmen would have been traveling up over the ridge on this side to attack the Shoshone. So when we talk about this particular massacre, just as was spoken of before, massacres are these really kind of earth-shaking, horrendous events where we have to seek to reconcile what happened and why it happened. Really all that we are able to do is provide some context for the event, and then the work of connecting the dots is kind of left open to whomever's thinking of it. But the date of this massacre is 1963, so obvious context there. We're in the middle of the Civil War. Utah, as we've mentioned previously, really isn't touched directly by the Civil War very much. They have a lot more of these sort of settler-native conflicts going on in that same period of time. Not to mention some of the Utah War stuff is stretching in to the same time frame. So they're worrying about overreach from the U.S. government, as well as poor relations with the Native Americans, those that are settled here. And so when we think about Abraham Lincoln's position as president during the Civil War, his whole mind is focused on that conflict, seeking an end to it, seeking reunification of those who have pulled out of the U.S. So in that level of distraction, he's really not focused very much on what's going on out here in the West. Not to mention, after the events of the Utah War, there's this lingering sentiment that Utah and its own militias can't be trusted. I mean, we had the Mountain Meadows Massacre in southern Utah, which seemed to be an action taken out by Utah militiamen against quote-unquote true Americans, right? Real citizens from the East. So that certainly doesn't help things as far as the perspective that people have on what Utah people are like and if they can be trusted. So what Lincoln ends up doing is he sends troops to establish a fort, Fort Douglas, right outside of University of Utah area, and it actually, interestingly enough, becomes part of Utah, or University of Utah. That's part of why the University of Utah became such a big campus. If you've ever been there, it's huge. But anyway, so he sends troops under the command of a colonel named Colonel Connors. And Colonel Connors is an interesting fellow. He comes with a very pertinent sense of poignant sense of distrust for Utah settlers and Utah Indians. And he's convinced, as kind of a carryover from all the whisperings that went on during the Utah War, he's convinced that Utah settlers and Native Americans are in cahoots against the U.S. government. They're combining to raise an army to come against the U.S. and all of this stuff. So that's his perspective right from the start when he gets here. Not to mention, he has his own qualms with Mormonism and the Mormon people in general. So he kind of equates his troubles with Native Americans as an extension of the bad policies of Mormon settlers. Not to mention their doctrine that he just wasn't fond of. So as a colonel that's stationed here, he tries to set up a few mining gigs, and the people aren't fond of it in the area he's in. He's just not all that well liked by the settlers, obviously, because he doesn't like them. But interestingly enough, he's not all that well liked by his own militiamen, as we'll talk about in just a minute here. But there are a few events that mark rising hostilities between the Shoshone and U.S. travelers, Utah settlers, basically everyone who was not Shoshone that was in the area. There was hostility with them in a very pertinent rising fashion leading up to this event. Obviously the Shoshone, this is where they the land that they claimed for a very long time. We ended up having sort of a state of instantaneous need to come to terms with whose land is whose and whose resources are whose. As soon as the Mormons came in 1847. So agreements are made and all of that jazz, and paperwork is signed, and people make these agreements. But the problem is that the Native Americans, particularly the Shoshone up in the north, they really did not foresee just how many Mormon settlers, or really any Utah settlers, were going to end up out here. They thought for sure, especially once they designated Salt Lake City as like their place, they thought that's where the people are going to be going. We're going to be fine out here. So things are they're going to be just fine. But obviously, it's not very long before Brigham Young, the big sort of, I'm going to settle the whole state sort of guy, he just keeps sending people into all parts of Utah to to pioneer new areas and set up new communities and all of this stuff. And Cache Valley is one of the earliest, probably as early as 1848. I'd have to go back and look on the dates on that, but very early on. And the people just come and come and come. So this would not have been as much of an issue, except for the fact that the Shoshone, just like many of the other native tribes in the state, depended on the land to provide them food. So sure, they did some farming and they did some of the agricultural stuff, but they very much depended on wildlife to survive, hunting wild game, and especially thriving off of a constant source of fish. That they could just fish trout all day long around here, and there's no problem at all. The settlers in Utah that came out here at such a huge number, an influx of population, they did not regulate themselves when it came to hunting or fishing. They just went to town, and there wasn't really a rule about it. If it was your land, your weapon, it was yours to do. And so this very quickly became problematic for the Shoshone because their wildlife seemed to just vanish overnight. The wildlife that they depended on to survive as a community. So as this continues to spiral out of control, people start to refer to, especially the northern Shoshone, as beggars, really. They used beggar terminology to refer to them because they were constantly in this destitute state of having no food, not having the clothing they needed, because their natural resources are just leaving. They're gone. So obviously they're asking settlers for some resources and there's some trade going on, but at the same time it's just not cutting it. So there are a few Shoshone chiefs that have had enough, and they just start stealing cattle. And you're going to be asking, well, where have we heard that before, right? Black Hawk War all over again. So, and it's a very linked issue. It's right around that same time frame almost. So that same thing's happening up here in northern Utah. The natives are stealing cattle and things to, in some ways, survive, and then in other circumstances, they're stealing or even just slaughtering the cattle as a means of protest, revenge, if you will. But so obviously, we're starting to see some rising tensions there, and some issues that are not being addressed need to be addressed. With all of that as a context, in comes the summer of 1859. There's a place in Idaho just above Pocatello called Fort Hall, just north of Pocatello. And there was a massacre that occurred there. There was a company of 19 travelers on the Oregon Trail. They were heading west, going through that area. And the Shoshone that were living in Utah and Idaho caught wind of this group of travelers and attacked them right there near Fort Hall. When the attack was carried out, it was obviously this surprise attack that we're not expecting anything to happen like that. But long story short, when all was said and done, the survivors ran off, and then 3 days later they were able to bring other people to come see what happened. There were 5 who were found dead at the scene, and 3 that were confirmed missing persons. so I don't think they ever found those 3. But of the 5 that were dead at the scene, there was one 5-year-old girl who'd had her ears cut off, her eyes gouged out, and her legs were cut off at the knees. When they looked at the layout of the area where she was at, it was obvious to them that the natives who had carried out the massacre had probably cut her legs off first, and while she was alive, forced her to walk on her knee stubs for the anguish, for the humiliation, whatever it was. It was a real horrendous scene for the men who went to go see this. So obviously that goes as viral as things can go in Utah in the 1860s. It's all up in the newspapers, and it does not help the fear factor between the settlers and the Native Americans. It just fuels the fire as far as how anxious people feel about what's about to happen. On top of that, the very next summer in 1860, there's another massacre that occurs. Surprise, surprise, a company that is traveling west on the Oregon Trail. This is a company of 44, attacked by a group of Shoshone and Bannock Indians. And this particular story is very interesting. So 11 are killed right off the bat, and then a group of 5 hide near the river, but they starve to death because they just don't find food in time. There's another group of 5 who, there was a group of about probably 10 who survived the initial onslaught, and then they stayed in the same attack area waiting for someone to come and rescue them. 5 of them did not survive long enough for the rescuers to arrive. It took the rescuers 45 days to come and rescue those who were still stranded there. But long story short, what ended up happening is there was a man, one of the leaders in the group. His name was Van Ornum. That was his last name. And Van Ornum, after this whole event, he was one of the survivors. He heard that a Shoshone band in Cache Valley had a white boy held captive that matched the age of his missing nephew, who was also on that voyage. He was one of the missing persons. So he locates the Shoshone warriors who, at that time, were to be found in Providence Canyon. So that should be a familiar place for a lot of you. This Shoshone warrior group was hiding out in Providence Canyon, and according to Van Ornum, they had a captive boy that was his nephew, and he was going to go get him. So he goes and complains to Colonel Connors, who doesn't like the Native Americans already anyway. He gobbles the story right up and sends a regiment to go assist him in retrieving the boy. So there's a battle, the Battle of Providence Canyon, and Chief Bear Hunter, who's really, he's at the forefront of pushing against the U.S. troops and the settlers and everything. He's the chief who is pushing to steal cattle and to attack here and there and attack people on the Oregon Trail and stuff. He's participant in a lot of that. So he's there in this group of Native Americans in Providence Canyon. So they're attacked there. They eventually get cornered and surrender. They raise the white flag. Chief Bear Hunter is then interrogated about the boy, who sends for the boy. The boy is returned to Van Ornum, and he says, yeah, it's my nephew, and he leaves. After the fact, there's a bunch of Native Americans who get super mad because they're convinced that this boy was not the nephew that this guy claimed that he was. That he was just saying that, and he was really a native boy who was born of a white mother and a native father. So there's some real anger over this particular issue, because it gets real personal for both the native group and the settlers that were involved in it. So there's fear that there's going to be retaliation. On top of all of that going on, so we've had 2 massacres that the Indians have carried out, and now we have an event in 1862 here at Bear River, so back in Idaho. Colonel Connor sent a bunch of men with General McGarry to essentially come to the Shoshone that were living in this area and recover a bunch of stolen cattle that he was convinced they had stolen, and they needed to give back. So he sends the troops to go get the cattle and return them to the owners. And what ends up happening is the natives catch wind of them coming, and they escape early on across the river, and then they essentially destroy the bridge behind them so that they can't be followed. But the troops arrive in time, at least, to send a few guys across the water without horses, who capture 4 of the Native Americans and bring them back as hostages. So McGarry now has 4 Shoshone hostages held at knife point, essentially, and he says, "Give back the cattle or I'm going to execute them." And what the Shoshone do is they decide to retreat further north rather than honor his request. And so McGarry decides, fine, that's your choice, and orders a firing squad to execute these 4 men, who I'm fairly certain they knew those 4 were not involved in the cattle raid. So it caused a lot of anger in the Shoshone. Obviously, their people are being executed now. They feel like they're having to answer for things that they haven't done and different stuff like that. So then we have attacks on freight companies that are freighting materials to Montana and back from Utah. One of these Montana trail freighters is attacked. He survives, and then he tells this story about how he hears from them that they are determined to avenge the blood of their dead comrades, those that McGarry executed, and intend to do so, quote, intended to kill every white man they ever that they meet north of the Bear River, right? So Bear River becomes this line that they draw, and they say, no white people north of this line or we will kill them in retribution. At least this is the story that we hear from the survivor of the Montana Trail freight hauling raid, which may or may not be reliable, but needless to say, his story catches enough wind. A lot of people are convinced that this is how the Shoshone feel. They're just going to start killing people. And the miners are again attacked on the Montana Trail, which does not engender any confidence in the Shoshone band, in their willingness for peace. And this was kind of near Franklin, so Franklin's even closer to our Cache Valley area. And after this particular attack, Colonel Connor had had enough. So he writes a report to the U.S. War Department stating that the attacks and murders committed on the trail, quote, for the last 15 years, was led by the same group of Shoshone in this latest attack. He also wrote that he was determined to, quote, chastise them if possible this coming winter. So it's essentially right after this Montana Trail attack in late 1862 that he determines, I'm going to attack the Shoshone. And this is me writing to the U.S. War Department explaining why. So that's basically all the written explanation we get from Colonel Connors about this whole ordeal. We know that the soldiers who were kept at Fort Douglas under his command were not in a happy place. And part of the reason is because they felt like they were doing nothing out here. They didn't like the Mormons, they didn't like the Indians, and nothing was happening in the first place, so they felt like they were wasting their time. They even signed a petition, particularly this was a petition written from the California volunteers who were stationed there. And they offered to take a major pay cut, and by major I mean losing $30,000 from their paycheck for the year, to pay for a naval passage to the East Coast so they could, quote, serve their country in shooting traitors instead of eating rations and freezing to death under sagebrush fires. So you get this sense that they are really trigger happy because they have brothers and fathers and cousins and nephews and a whole bunch of family in the East fighting for the Union and dying for the Union, and they feel like they're just sort of camped here doing nothing. So they're really anxious to be engaged in something, and it's that anxiety is going to prove to be kindling for the real brutality of what happens here. So on the morning of the attack, it's January 29th, 1863. McGarry and so General McGarry and Colonel Connor, they arrive with their men here at the Bear River area around 6 in the morning, just about at daybreak at that time of the year. And that year was a particularly cold winter, and that was said to be the coldest day of the year. So they estimate that at the time it was probably lower than 25 below zero. So it was very cold. The soldiers tell a lot of stories about their whiskey freezing because it was supposed to keep them warm, but can't do much good if it's frozen solid. But Chief Sandwich, who is one of the chiefs here, the Shoshone chiefs in the area, he describes that point in the morning. He looks up and he sees what he describes as a peculiar morning fog rolling over the ridge, and that's this ridge out here, right? This ridge here. So he comes to find very quickly this isn't a fog. This isn't a fog at all. It's actually produced entirely by the cold weather and the breath of horses and men. So he finds out that the troops are here and they look armed, they look ready to attack. They were expecting troops to arrive. They'd actually made some preparations for it, but they were not expecting an attack. They thought it would be more of a negotiation, which is unfortunate for them. So what ends up happening at the beginning is Connor instructs his men to come down the ridge. He's got a cavalry and he's got men as well. The artillery never made it, but he tried to bring artillery. So they're coming from the ridge, and he orders a frontal assault. and the frontal assault does not work out. It ends up, they end up being pushed back. So when they're pushed back, he sends a few fragments of his forces to go east and west and to go further north to try to flank them on the sides and from up above. And so that's his plan. It doesn't end up being necessary because the ammunition that the natives had wasn't very much. It only lasted them about 2 hours. And then they were just out of ammo. So then they're raising the white flag, and they're asking for a truce, for a negotiation, and that was not Connor's plan. At this point, he had made up his mind he was going to carry out a slaughter. So the wind is just terrible right now. I'm sorry, that storm is blowing through. I think it's the weather. It's responding to this story. You know, it's a horrendous event. So ultimately, what happens is they just go riding through with very little resistance now that they're out of ammo, and they just start killing men, women, and children. Very few of the survivors, very few of the Shoshone that were here ended up surviving the event. They estimate, and there are fluctuating estimations, there always are with events like this. People try to make it look either less severe or more severe than it really was, and there's no escaping that. But they estimate somewhere between 250 and 490 Shoshone were killed in this event. That Chief Sandwich that I mentioned previously, he's one of the very few survivors. The reason why is because during the battle, especially during the massacre portion, he gets a group together and he decides we need to survive this so that we can tell the story, so that we can carry on our culture, so we can carry on our people. So it's our duty to run and to abandon our people. So and a few of them felt like it was abandonment, but he was convinced they had to do it to survive and carry on. So they try to escape. His horse is actually shot out from under him, but miraculously he does make it out. He's out of the ring of those who are surrounding them at that point. And once that happens, he escapes to the river. Obviously, coldest day of the year, river's not ideal, but he happened to know that it had a warm spring there. And so he jumps in the water right where the warm spring is and ends up surviving to tell the tale. So he and the few others that survived, as well as other Shoshone that weren't here at the time, many of them ended up essentially approaching the Mormon church leaders and asking for assistance. And assistance was given, and several of them ended up actually converting to Mormonism, I think mostly out of a need to find a peaceful resolution and to not be hunted anymore. But that's the event. I'm sorry, I'm getting rained out here, but that's about the end of our story. Kind of a sad event. It's shocking that we live so close to the area that something like this occurred in. It's crazy. It's just right up here in Preston, Idaho. And I think that's important to recognize, right? That sometimes we consider ourselves fairly distant from big horrendous events, but sometimes they're right on our doorstep.